Hey, welcome back, everybody. Here I am with part two of the Strayer Chapter 10 Colonial Encounters. I haven't heard back from anybody about part one because you haven't seen it yet, but I want to get this done. So if you give me some feedback, maybe there'll be some changes in part three. This is going to pick up where we left off on page 449 of the textbook, and we'll go to page 459. And I'm got my notes up here that I can look at as well that I prepared for this little talk. So I'm going to go through the slides right now, and hopefully I'll get done with this with under 10 minutes. So the first section of this next part of the chapter is ways of working, comparing colonial economies. And so Strayer starts off just by talking about the way that colonial rule affected people's lives in a very profound way, especially in the way they worked. So this is all about economics and jobs, things people would do. Goes into talking about the changing role of women as well, and the role of men, and then also about migration of different peoples around different parts of different empires. And we'll talk about that briefly. Big overview is simply put, as Europeans were growing their economy, they needed more raw materials. We've talked about this before, and what you get with raw materials is a need for more cash crops, right? All these things, the cotton, the cacao for cocoa, the peanuts, coconut oil, you name it. All these things are the cash crops. In different countries, they focus on different crops more than others, and different goods. And so, like cotton in Egypt, for example, we'll talk about a few more in this discussion. And people are not going to be growing the food crops that they're used to doing. Their subsistence farming will become basically a job for women in most places more than ever before, and that could lead to a lot of some places famine, as we'll see in places such as India. So that's a big issue here. All right, very important to kind of be aware of that. So if you were an artisan in one of these colonies, say you were a loomer, that is somebody who would weave cotton together to make fabric and clothing in India, you would see your way of life disappear because you could not compete with the mass produced manufactured goods from Europe. The British would flood the markets of India and other places with their cheaply made shirts and pants and so on, and the people would obviously buy that because it's more affordable. They also actually directly prevented the people who were competing with them from making their goods the way they used to. So the British, not only did they kind of ruin the Indian market for textile manufacturing that existed British rule by flooding it and basically undercutting the prices, but they also legally prohibited them from making the goods. So a lot of times you'll see direct law preventing people from taking advantage of their own industrial manufacturing, and other times you'll just see them unable to compete with the European dominance in terms of the large amount of goods that the Europeans would flood their markets with. Hopefully that makes sense. But basically, a lot of African and Asian merchants were squeezed out of the business. They just couldn't compete with the Europeans. The Europeans always had an advantage for that. So then we get into kind of the idea of forced labor and the power of the state or the government. That's the next section that Strayer talks about. Clearly, for a colony to do really well, they need to have cheap labor, and the most efficient cheap, or I don't know about the most efficient, but definitely the cheapest cheap labor is free labor. And so a lot of times there were in different situations this idea of unpaid labor where they basically said you must work for free. And they had systems similar to like the Mita system that the Inca had, and that the Spanish had in the Americas, the Encomienda system, where in some colonies they required men to work for a certain amount of time. That happened a lot, like in French West Africa, or in the Congo Free State, which is obviously an Orwellian name. It was definitely not free. That would be basically the largest colony in Africa, as we'll see in terms of population and wealth. Basically, the private colony of the King of Belgium. We'll learn about this in class, King Leopold. And his big raw material that he was looking for was rubber. And they would force people to extract rubber, and if they didn't, they would hold their family members hostage. So that's just an example of just a very light, very very cursory overview of what happened in the Congo, but it's an example of forced labor. And then Indonesia, they had the cultivation system where they said you must give us 20% of your crop in taxes. That's just 20% for free. Another example of free labor. Sometimes people resisted this, obviously, more often than you would think, and especially what the Europeans would want people to know in history. The Maji Maji Rebellion, we'll also look at that in class, in Tanganyika. Is a great example. That would be in East Africa, in which they resisted kind of the forced labor of cotton as a cash crop. And actually, it caused the Germans to change their policies because it was such a violent uprising. So we'll learn about that in class as an example of a colonial resistance to European rule. This is an image here from the Congo Free State. Basically, these children likely had their hands chopped off because soldiers who work for the Force Publique, basically the military of the Belgians in the Congo, were given bullets, and every bullet that they shot, they had to prove they killed somebody by giving a human hand. Sometimes they would shoot an animal, and they would take a hand from somebody without killing them so that they can get another bullet. This is super tragic. We'll talk about that in class as well. So this is super important for you to understand. The idea of free labor was something that Europeans definitely sought as much as they could. Obviously, that's going to lead to a lot of starvation because people are working for free for the Europeans. They're not growing subsistence crops. They're focusing on cash crops, and that's going to lead to a lot of deaths. We're going to see that even in Java in Indonesia, as they're growing cash crops to pay the Indonesian government. They're 20%. They don't grow enough food for themselves, and there's mass starvation. Again, like I said before, in German East Africa, Tanganyika, there was a similar concern about famine due to cotton cultivation, and that led to the Maji Maji Rebellion. Okay, so that's kind of the issue of cash crop agriculture, why people would be pulled, go back here. That's the issue of kind of the economics of coercion. Now I'm going to get into cash crop agriculture and the pull of this market. Okay, I'm going a little bit ahead of my slides here. I got to kind of make sure I'm on pace with myself here. Sorry about that. So why would you want to be pulled into this market of cash crops if it is so bad? Well, it's not always bad for everybody in these colonies. So many people are happy to see this increase in cash crop production because they benefit. And in some places, people benefited. The great example is in the Irrawaddy Delta and what we call Burma today, where farmers grew lots of rice, and they actually were able to feed a lot of people with it, and they made a lot of money, and the British helped them privatize that property in that great capitalist way. They owned their own property, they built big houses, and they were able to benefit in their own minds. And so especially the leaders of these communities did really well. So people really liked the idea of cash crops. In the Mekong Delta in South Vietnam, the French also promoted this expansion of rice cultivation. A lot of times it led to environmental degradation as they tore out indigenous crops like mangroves and things like that along the delta. But local farmers saw themselves benefit by producing these cash crops to sell on the global market. And in the Gold Coast or Ghana, we see cacao, a very important crop we know is from the Americas, leading Ghana to be the world's largest producer, which is kind of crazy to think about, that this crop is taken from the Americas to Africa, where it is most heavily produced. And it becomes a very big producer by 1911, leading the world in production. So you can see the people who are involved in that, the leaders of Ghana who are involved in that trading process, are going to benefit, and they're going to be pulled into that. They will like it. Unfortunately, this dependence causes problems. People are exploited more. Sometimes men will marry women simply because they know that they will get their wives to work with them. A lot of times, as there's an increase in a cash crop, say in Ghana, people from other parts of Africa are going to move to that area for labor, for work. There are going to be different ethnic groups, different languages. That's going to lead to a lot of tensions and a lot of problems that are going to develop along with this changing economy. So that's important to be aware of. Okay. Next one is economics of wage labor. So migration for work. Okay. So lots of wage labor. It's a very common thing in European enterprises and businesses. And since they went to Africa and Asia, they're going to kind of expect this continuation of wage labor to happen in their colonies. So we have a lot of people moving from Africa to other places, and we have a lot of people from Asia moving to other places within these larger British and French empires primarily. So in South Africa, you have to move because 88% of the land is owned by the 20% white population. And so they force the Africans to move to their own little townships, their own areas, similar to what happens to indigenous people in the United States. And in Asia, the Chinese government itself encourages people to move to Manchuria to kind of block Russian encroachment, like basically saying we already have a lot of people living here, Russians, you don't have the right to come. But also people from China move to other places such as Malaysia to work in tin mines. They moved to California, our own California, to work in the service industry primarily. Originally they were working in gold mines and things like that, but the state of California passed laws to prevent them from doing that, so they had to work in other fields. They helped build the railway, the Transcontinental Railroad, on the west coast side of the United States, only to be later banned from further immigration due to frustration caused by Irish immigrants who were upset that they had to compete with Chinese immigrants for labor, not to mention all the racist perceptions that went along with it. And of course, the hotbed location for all that is San Francisco itself, which prides itself as being a very diverse place, but it's founded on a very racist history, which some people would say is still the case today. It's probably, I think it's safe to say that it's like the probably one of the greatest examples of economic inequality on the West Coast still today, if not racial. So that's just my little bit from reading the news. So here we go. Lots of people moving into cities as well. That's going to usually be places of poverty, not very conducive to a kind of well suited way of living. Okay, so if you are lucky enough, you might be part of the Western educated middle class in your society, and you might get an education in the colonial dominant language, be it English or French or Dutch, say in Indonesia, and you might have a bit of more power than the average person, but that was fairly rare in terms of the overall population. Okay, so super important to recognize that. It is important for statistics. The Strayer mentions about 29 million people from India moved to other places. So they moved as far away as to the Caribbean, to Fiji. They still have descendants there in these places today. Again, we talked about how people from China moved to different places as well, the United States and so on. So it's just important to understand that there's a lot of movement that's going on at this time. Okay. So let's go on to the next step. Okay, this is an image here. I'm just jumping around here, but this is a great example of cash crops. This is in your book. This is in Ceylon or Sri Lanka today, and they are growing, as you can tell, Lipton tea, right? So this is a cash crop for export, and we know the British love their tea still today, okay? Which is not obviously originally from Great Britain, right? That's something they developed a habit from because of their colonial history. Okay, so the next part is we're going to continue kind of the colonial economics and we'll look at women and the colonial economy. So it's important to recognize that there's a big shift in the type of labor that women do. So women used to do kind of combined labor with men. They always worked in subsistence farming. They worked in the fields with men. Sometimes they had different jobs. Men maybe would herd the animals and maybe do some hunting if that was required. Women would definitely grow crops. But the gist of it is the women would help out with the farming, and they shared a lot of labor responsibilities with men, if not the same job, similar jobs. Because of imperialism or colonization, in a lot of places there's a divergence or a shift in the way men and women work. It's very important to recognize that. So men tended to dominate the lucrative export crops. So any cash crops, the men were going to focus on that because they knew that's where they were going to get the most money. And women had to do all the subsistence work, the stuff they shared with men before. Now they're doing all by themselves. So they have a lot more labor required. And other times men left because they couldn't stay. They had to get money, and they were the only ones who would get hired, so they had to leave to go to other places to work in the fields or the mines for the cash crops or the natural resources that were being extracted. The little stat I have here, which is in your book, is that studies show that in Cameroon, women worked about 46 hours a week before colonization, and by the 1900s, they were working 70 hours a week. So things aren't getting better for them. This is an example of kind of the negative effects of colonization in terms of the amount of work required for women. Okay, so it's important to, I keep saying it's important, everything's important in this case, but this is super important for you to be aware of. There are some benefits for women in some cases. Sometimes they did get to grow crops that had greater cash value. And so the example of cassava in Nigeria is a good one in the sense that that became the dominant crop that made a lot of money, and a lot of women, that became their crop. And so they were able to obtain a degree of independence from the patriarchy, if you will, and they were pretty happy with that. But men don't like that often, and what do you do, whether you're in Africa or you're in Europe or you're probably in America or Asia? When you don't like women becoming more independent, you accuse them of being witches, right? So there was a lot of accusations of witchcraftery among women during this time as a way to kind of limit and control them. Very important to be aware of that. This is an example of women in Gambia thrashing peanuts, right? So this is another example. So this is an example of women being involved in the cash crop process, but most of the time that was a process that was reserved for men. So super important to recognize that. You can guess I'm going to say that, right? Super important. Okay, so the last part of this section is assessing the colonial development. So there's 3 points here that Strayer brings up. There's a big argument on the overall impact of colonial rule. Some people say it was good because it jump-started modern growth for these areas, and if it weren't for European colonization, they never would have developed systems of economic connections to other parts of the world. Other people say, yeah, I think there could have been better ways of doing that. This is just straight up exploitation and very limited, uneven growth. All the money goes to Europe. There's not a lot for Africa or Asia. Come on, give me a break. That is not a good argument. So, you have your defenders and your critics. So just kind of be aware of those two arguments there. But the fact is that Europe's economy grew dramatically, and by the time of independence for most of these countries, they were poor. They did not see a lot of economic growth. They definitely did not reap the benefits of it. But they did get connected to the global exchange network. And so that is important to be aware of, whether they liked it or not. And then, of course, there were some modernizing elements again. Very small bit of solace could be found in that for people, but they had some bureaucratic structures when the Europeans left. They had railroad systems and roads and communication. They had schools and the introduction of some healthcare. But of course, again, most people would say that no way out is vastly outweighed by all the extraction and abuse that was suffered upon these parts of the world by Europeans during the age of colonization. So then they had no big breakthrough to modern industrial societies. So we're going to stop here at page 459. I pretty much went through part 2 pretty quickly. Hope I didn't miss a whole lot or skip a whole lot, but I'll just go over the rest in class. But if you kind of listen to this and you went along with the book, this is the gist of what's covered in those 10 pages. Okay, thanks so much, and I'll see you for part 3 next time. Bye.